Blood seeped through the warped wooden planks of the abandoned cabin as Eleanor Hartwell pressed her trembling hands against her daughters' mouths, their wide eyes reflecting the orange glow of torches outside. The sight of crimson pooling beneath her knees brought back the memory that haunted her dreams, Thomas lying pale and still in their bed last spring, blood trickling from his lips as the fever consumed him, whispering her name one final time before the light faded from his eyes. "You made your choice, Eleanor." Judge Matthias Blackwood's voice cut through the Wyoming winter night like a blade through silk. "Now face the consequences." The thundering of hooves circled the ramshackle structure like vultures around carrion, each revolution tightening the noose of fear around her throat. Rose, 12 years old, with her mother's auburn hair, and Thomas's stubborn jaw clutched 8-year-old Grace against her chest as the smaller girl whimpered into her sister's shoulder. "Mrs. Hartwell." Another voice, younger and uncertain, probably Deputy Morrison, barely 19 and still fool enough to believe in Blackwood's version of justice. "Judge says, if you come out peaceful-like, he'll be merciful to the little ones." Eleanor's jaw clenched. Blackwood's mercy was a rattlesnake's kiss, beautiful and deadly. Through a gap in the boarded window, she caught sight of his substantial frame silhouetted against the torchlight, silver-headed cane glinting in his gloved hand. At 52, Matthias Blackwood had built his empire on the graves of better men, and Eleanor knew exactly what fate awaited her daughters if she surrendered. The hoofbeats stopped. In the suffocating silence, Eleanor heard her own ragged breathing and the distant howl of wind through Devil's Canyon, the local name for this God-forsaken stretch of rocks where countless travelers had met their end. Then Blackwood's voice again, closer now, right outside the door. "I'm a patient man, Eleanor, but winter ain't. You can freeze to death in there, or you can be reasonable." Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering 4 days ago when her world had shattered like glass against stone. The morning had started with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of her daughter's laughter. Now it might end with their blood on the snow. She had no way of knowing that 20 miles away, a Cheyenne warrior named Swift Arrow was tracking their pursuers through the mountain passes, a silver cross burning against his chest, a cross that held the key to everything. 4 days earlier, autumn had painted Copper Ridge in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor Hartwell kneaded dough in the back room of her bakery, while Rose swept the front counter with the methodical precision of someone twice her age, and Grace arranged day-old rolls in the discount basket, humming a song Thomas used to sing. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell." Judge Matthias Blackwood's voice made her skin crawl as effectively as fingernails on slate. Eleanor looked up to find him filling her doorway, his expensive Eastern suit, a stark contrast to the rough frontier town beyond. His pale eyes, the color of winter ice, traveled from her face to her flour-dusted apron with an intensity that made her stomach turn. "Judge." Eleanor wiped flour from her hands, forcing politeness into her voice. "What brings you by so early?" Blackwood stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him with deliberate finality. The bakery suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. "Business, Eleanor. Always business." His gaze lingered on her wedding ring, a simple gold band that caught the morning light. "Though I confess there's pleasure in conducting business with a woman of your considerable qualities." Rose had already begun herding Grace toward the back room, her young face tight with an understanding that no 12-year-old should possess. Eleanor positioned herself between Blackwood and her daughters, though the gesture felt futile against a man who commanded half the territory through fear and corruption. "I managed just fine on my own," Eleanor said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Thomas's death had left them with debt's uncertainty and the constant struggle of a woman alone in a man's world. "Oh, I know you do." Blackwood's smile revealed teeth stained with tobacco and years of bitter victories. "That's what makes you so remarkable." "But managing ain't thriving, Eleanor. This territory's growing railroads coming through in 2 years bring prosperity to those smart enough to position themselves properly. He gestured around the modest bakery. A woman in your position needs protection, guidance, a man's firm hand. The words felt like a spider crawling up her spine. Eleanor had seen this conversation approaching like storm clouds on the horizon, but knowing didn't make it easier to weather. I appreciate the concern, Judge, but Matthias. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of expensive whiskey on his breath, despite the early hour. A man confident enough to drink before noon was a man who feared no consequences. Call me Matthias. We're going to be much closer, you and I. I don't think that's appropriate. Blackwood laughed a sound like gravel in a tin cup. Appropriate, Eleanor's sweetheart, appropriate is a luxury for people with choices. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, intimate and threatening. You're a widow with 2 daughters running a business on land that ain't even properly yours. Thomas never finished the paperwork on that deed, did he? Died before he could file with the territorial office in Cheyenne. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Thomas had been working on the land claim when the fever took him riding to Cheyenne to complete the documentation. She'd assumed the paperwork was filed, that their home was secure. The deed is legal. She said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Thomas bought this plot fair and square from Pete Morrison. From Pete Morrison, who never had legal title, neither. Blackwood's grin widened like a crack in ice, revealing the predator beneath the civilized veneer. Funny thing about territorial law, Eleanor. Without proper documentation filed within 6 months of purchase, land reverts to available for claim. I've got friends in the territorial office, friends who appreciate my contributions to bringing civilization to this corner of Wyoming. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. This bakery, the small house behind it, the 1/4 acre of land where Thomas had planned to expand everything he'd worked for. Everything that kept her daughters fed and sheltered, it could all disappear with the stroke of a pen. What do you want? The words came out as barely a whisper. What I've always wanted. Blackwood reached out to touch her cheek, and Eleanor flinched away as if his fingers were red-hot iron. His expression hardened, revealing the cruel intelligence that had made him the most feared man in 3 counties. You, Eleanor, as my wife, your daughters would have a proper father security, a future worth having. And I'd have a legitimate claim to prime real estate that's about to become very valuable. Eleanor felt trapped between a wolf and a cliff edge. And if I refuse, then you'll discover just how difficult life can become for a woman who doesn't understand her place. Blackwood's voice remained conversational, but menace dripped from every word like honey laced with poison. Accidents happen to stubborn people, Eleanor. Buildings catch fire. Children get lost in the wilderness. Debts get called in by impatient creditors. The threat hung in the air between them, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eleanor thought of her daughters sleeping peacefully in the house behind the bakery, trusting their mother to keep them safe. She thought of Thomas, of the promises they'd made to each other, of the life they'd built from nothing through hard work and love. No. The word emerged stronger than Eleanor felt, carrying all the defiance she could muster. I won't marry you, Matthias. Not for land, not for security, not for anything. Blackwood's face flushed red above his starched collar, and for a moment, Eleanor saw past the veneer of civilization to something far more dangerous, a spoiled child who'd grown into a man accustomed to having his every desire fulfilled through fear and violence. You're making a mistake, Eleanor. A serious mistake. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But don't worry, you'll have time to reconsider. Amazing how circumstances can change a person's perspective. He straightened his cuffs with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to demonstrate his control. You know, it's interesting. Had a report this morning about some of my prize cattle dying. Mysterious-like. Doc Peterson thinks it might be poison, something mixed into their feed. Eleanor's chest tightened like a fist, closing around her heart. I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't see what that has to do with... Found something curious near the water trough. Blackwood's pale eyes never left her face. A bag of flour with your bakery's mark on it. Funny thing that. Almost like someone was trying to hide evidence after a job gone wrong. That's impossible. I would never... Course not. Upstanding woman like you. Blackwood tipped his hat with mock courtesy. But evidence is evidence, Eleanor. In this territory, justice is what I say it is. You might want to think about that before you make any more unwise decisions. He left without another word, but his presence lingered like the stench of sulfur after a lightning strike. Eleanor sank against the counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Rose emerged from the back room, her young face pale but determined. Mama, what did he want? Eleanor looked at her daughter, too young to bear such burdens, yet old enough to understand the danger they faced. Nothing we can't handle, sweetheart. Nothing we can't handle. But as she watched Blackwood's carriage disappear down the dusty main street, Eleanor knew she was lying. In Copper Ridge, Judge Matthias Blackwood was the law, and the law wanted her to submit or die. The trial, if it could be called, that took place 2 days later in Murphy's saloon. Judge Blackwood presided from behind the bar, while 20 men sat at tables nursing whiskey and avoiding Eleanor's eyes. She stood in the center of the room with Rose and Grace flanking her, 3 figures of defiance in a sea of cowardice. The evidence was as manufactured as Eleanor had expected, a flour sack bearing a crude imitation of her bakery's marked testimony from Blackwood's hired hands about finding it near his poisoned cattle, and the solemn pronouncement that arsenic residue had been detected in the flour. That's not my flour, Eleanor protested when given the chance to speak. Anyone could have put my mark on a sack and planted it as evidence. You calling me a liar, Mrs. Hartwell? Blackwood's voice carried across the silent saloon like the crack of a whip. Eleanor looked around at the faces she'd known for 3 years, men who'd bought her bread, whose wives had shared coffee and gossip in her kitchen, whose children had played with Rose and Grace. Not one would meet her gaze. Fear had made cowards of them all. I'm saying I'm innocent of these charges. Juries heard the evidence. Blackwood's gavel, actually a hammer borrowed from Peterson's workshop, slammed against the bar with the finality of a coffin nail. Guilty of malicious destruction of property and attempted murder by poisoning. Sentence is immediate exile from Copper Ridge and surrounding territorial limits. This isn't justice, Eleanor said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. This is revenge for a woman who dared to say no to a man accustomed to getting his way. Justice is what I say it is in my territory. Blackwood replied, his pale eyes glittering with triumph. Don't like it? Take it up with the territorial governor. Oh, wait, he's a personal friend of mine, bought and paid for like everything else worth having. Eleanor felt the walls closing in like the sides of a grave. No money for a proper lawyer, no way to appeal, nowhere to run in a territory where Blackwood's influence reached into every courthouse and government office. My daughters have done nothing wrong, she said, playing her last card. Let them stay. I'll go alone. Your daughters are welcome to remain under my protection, Blackwood said with false magnanimity. I'll see they're properly cared for, given the education and opportunities befitting young ladies of quality. The implication hung in the air like a noose. Eleanor's daughters would become Blackwood's wards, trapped in his household, until they were old enough to serve his purposes or be sold to the highest bidder. Like hell. Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. They go where I go. Blackwood shrugged with theatrical indifference. Your choice. But winter's coming early this year, and the mountains don't care about maternal sentiment. Might want to reconsider. That night, Eleanor loaded their possessions into Thomas's old wagon, while Rose helped Grace pack her few treasured belongings. They had enough food for perhaps a week, $37 in savings hidden in a coffee tin, and no destination beyond away from here. As they rolled out of Copper Ridge under a canopy of stars, Eleanor looked back once. Every window in town was dark except one Blackwood's office, where a silhouette watched their departure from behind expensive curtains, like a spider observing flies caught in its web. "Or, where are we going, Mama?" Grace asked from the wagon bed, wrapped in quilts that smelled of home and better times. Eleanor faced forward into the endless Wyoming darkness, where mountains loomed like sleeping giants and the wind carried promises of winter's early arrival. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll figure it out together." Now, 4 days later, that optimism felt like naive stupidity. They'd made it perhaps 20 miles before the wolves found them, and another 10 before Blackwood's men picked up their trail. Eleanor had been forced to abandon the wagon when the terrain became too rough, loading what they could carry onto Thomas's old mare while destroying anything that might aid their pursuers. The wolves had come first, 6 gray shapes materializing from the timber like ghosts hungry for blood. Eleanor had raised Thomas's rifle with shaking hands, knowing that even if she hit the pack leader, the others would be on them before she could reload. That's when the arrow had appeared, as if conjured from the darkness itself, sprouting from the lead wolf's shoulder with a wet thunk that sent the entire pack fleeing into the night. The man who emerged from the shadows moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Tall and lean, dressed in a mixture of traditional buckskin and practical wool clothing, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in these mountains as completely as the wolves he'd just driven off. "You are far from home," he said in accented but clear English, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he stepped into their camp. Eleanor kept the rifle trained on him, though her arms trembled with exhaustion and cold. "So are you," the man smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features from intimidating to almost gentle. "This is my home. You are the strangers here." He gestured toward the direction the wounded wolf had fled. "Lucky for you, I was hunting nearby when I heard the pack closing in. We don't need your help." Eleanor said, though, even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they sounded. "No 4 days you've been wandering these mountains. I've been watching your progress, if it can be called progress. You have little food, less water, and winter comes early this year." The man crouched by their fire, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "Your children are cold and frightened. Pride is a luxury you cannot afford." Grace peeked out from behind Eleanor's skirts, her 8-year-old curiosity overcoming fear. "Are you really an Indian, like in Mama's stories?" "Grace," Eleanor hissed, but the man laughed a sound as warm as summer wind through pine trees. "I am Cheyenne. My name is Swift Arrow." He looked at Grace with genuine warmth, as if her innocent question delighted rather than offended him. "What is your name, little one?" "Grace. This is my big sister Rose, and that's my mama, but she's scared to tell you her name." "I'm not scared," Eleanor protested, earning a skeptical look from her eldest daughter. "Eleanor," Rose said firmly. "Her name is Eleanor Hartwell, and we're not lost. We're running away from a bad man who wants to hurt Mama." Swift Arrow's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. "This bad man, he has sent others to follow you." "How did you—" Eleanor began. "I told you I've been watching. 6 riders, maybe 8 hours behind you now. They move like men with a purpose, carrying enough supplies for a long hunt." Swift Arrow's voice carried the weight of hard experience. "They will not stop until they find what they seek." Eleanor's heart sank like a stone dropped in deep water. Of course, Blackwood wouldn't let them simply disappear into the wilderness. Too many loose ends, too many people who might ask uncomfortable questions about a widow and her children vanishing without a trace. "Why would you help us?" she asked. "Your people and mine. We haven't exactly been friendly neighbors." Something flickered across Swift Arrow's face pain, perhaps, or the weight of old memories. "No, we have not been friends." But you are outcasts now like me. And I do not like to see children suffer for the sins of adults. Eleanor studied his face in the firelight, searching for deception or hidden motives. Instead, she found something unexpected, genuine compassion mixed with a grief that matched her own. "There's a place I know," Swift Arrow continued. "Hidden from white men's maps, sacred to my people. You will be safe there at least for a time." Eleanor looked at her daughter's Grace shivering despite the quilts, Rose trying to be brave, but clearly exhausted beyond her years. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings about trusting a Cheyenne warrior, about everything she'd been taught since childhood regarding his people. But another part, the part that had defied Judge Blackwood and chosen exile over submission, recognized something in Swift Arrow's eyes. Honor, perhaps, or simple human decency in a world that seemed to have precious little of either. "All right," she said, "lead the way." Swift Arrow's hidden sanctuary nestled in a box canyon perhaps 3 miles from where the wolves had found them. Red sandstone walls rose on 3 sides, like the walls of a natural cathedral, while a narrow entrance provided the only access from the outside world. A small fire burned in a ring of stones, sheltered from wind by an overhang of rock that bore ancient pictographs, spirals and animals and human figures that seemed to dance in the shifting light. My people have used this place for generations," Swift Arrow explained as he helped them unload their meager possessions. "A stopping place for hunting parties, a refuge in times of trouble. The whites have never found it, though some have tried." As they settled around his fire, Grace curled up in her mother's lap, while Rose sat close enough to touch. Swift Arrow produced jerky and some kind of root vegetable from his supplies, sharing without question or expectation of payment. The food was strange, but nourishing, and Eleanor realized she hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. "You speak English very well," she observed as they ate. "Mission school when I was younger. The black robes thought they could make me into a white man." Swift Arrow's smile held no humor. "They succeeded perhaps more than they intended." "What do you mean?" "I learned to read their papers, understand their laws, speak their language. Useful skills when negotiating treaties that will be broken before the ink is dry." The bitterness in his voice was as sharp as winter wind through bare branches. Eleanor heard something in his tone that matched her own pain, the sound of someone who'd lost everything to forces beyond their control. "You've lost people." Swift Arrow was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, as if it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. "My wife, my son, killed by soldiers who claimed they were hunting hostiles." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "A 7-year-old boy gathering firewood, and a woman preparing medicine herbs. Very dangerous enemies of the United States. I'm sorry. Sorry is a word white people use when they do nothing to stop the hurting." Swift Arrow looked at her directly, and Eleanor saw depths of pain that made her own losses seem small by comparison. "Your husband, how did he die?" "Fever. Last spring." Eleanor pulled Grace closer, remembering Thomas's final days, the helpless feeling of watching someone you love slip away, despite all your efforts to save them. "And now you are hunted by other white people. Why?" Eleanor found herself telling him everything Blackwood's obsession with her and her land, the manufactured evidence, the mockery of a trial that had condemned her family to exile. Swift Arrow listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing her story like dry earth soaking up rain. "This Judge Blackwood," he said when she finished. "He believes himself to be the law in your town. He doesn't just believe it, he is the law. Sheriff Morrison takes his orders, the mayor owes him money, and anyone who opposes him ends up dead or driven out. Such men are dangerous, not because they are strong, but because they are weak. They fear any challenge to their authority." Swift Arrow poked at the fire, with a stick sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky above their canyon refuge. "Tell me, has he done this before, driven out others who opposed him?" Eleanor thought about it, remembering families who'd left town, suddenly businesses that had failed under mysterious circumstances, men who'd spoken out against Blackwood's policies and found themselves facing trumped-up charges. "Yes," she said slowly. "I think he has. Then he has made many enemies. Enemies who might be willing to act if given the right opportunity." "What are you thinking?" Swift arrow met her eyes, and Eleanor saw something that hadn't been there before, the glitter of a plan taking shape. "I'm thinking that wolves are dangerous when they hunt alone, but vulnerable when separated from their pack." That night, as Eleanor lay in Swift Arrow's lean-to with her daughters pressed against her for warmth, she found herself studying the Cheyenne warrior's profile as he kept watch by the dying fire. There was something about him, a quiet strength that reminded her of Thomas, a sense of honor that seemed as natural as breathing. For the first time since leaving Copper Ridge, she felt something other than despair. The next morning brought the distant sound of horses and shouting voices echoing off the canyon walls. Eleanor woke to Swift Arrow's hand on her shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips for silence. Through the lean-to's opening, she could see him crouched at the canyon's rim, peering through a gap in the rocks, like a hunter studying his prey. "How many?" she whispered. "8 riders. Your Judge Blackwood is not among them, but I recognize the type." Swift Arrow's voice was grim as winter storm clouds. "They move like soldiers, but they wear no uniform. Hired guns." Eleanor's stomach clenched like a fist closing around broken glass. "Can they find us here?" "This canyon is well hidden, but they have an Indian tracker with them, a crow who sells his skills to the highest bidder. If they find our trail from last night?" "What do we do?" Swift Arrow was already moving, gathering supplies with the efficient speed of a man accustomed to running from danger. "We leave. There are other places to hide deeper in the sacred mountains, where even crow trackers fear to go." "What about our things?" "Take only what you can carry. Speed matters more than possessions now." Eleanor woke her daughters and explained the situation in whispered words that tried to convey urgency without panic. Rose, bless her, simply nodded and began rolling their blankets into tight bundles. Grace looked frightened, but trusted her sister's calm example, gathering her few treasures with the solemnity of a much older child. They loaded what they could onto Swift Arrow's horses, a pair of sturdy mountain ponies that seemed unfazed by the extra weight or the tension radiating from their riders. Eleanor mounted behind Grace on one horse, while Rose rode with Swift Arrow on the other, leaving behind the remnants of their old life like shed skin. Swift Arrow led them up a narrow trail that switchbacked along the canyon wall, invisible from below unless you knew exactly where to look. The horses picked their way carefully over loose stone and patches of ice, while Eleanor fought vertigo every time she looked down at the dizzying drop below. They rode for hours through country that grew progressively wilder and more desolate. Red rock gave way to pine forest, which in turn yielded to bare granite peaks dusted with early snow that glittered like diamonds in the thin mountain air. The wind cut through Eleanor's coat like knives forged from winter itself. And Grace shivered constantly, despite being wrapped in every blanket they possessed. "Where are we going?" Eleanor called over the wind. "There is a place my people call the Heart of Stone," Swift Arrow replied. "Sacred beyond measure, forbidden to all but the most holy of our warriors. If Blackwood's men follow us there, the mountain spirits will claim them." "Spirits? Your people would call them ghosts, warriors who died defending their families, who could not find peace in the world beyond. The crow tracker will not follow us into such a place, no matter how much he is paid." They stopped to rest at midday, though the pale sun provided little warmth at this altitude. Swift Arrow produced more jerky and a pouch of what looked like crushed berries, mixed with fat pemmican, he called it. Nutritious, but requiring an acquired taste Eleanor hadn't yet developed. "Mama," Grace said quietly, her breath visible in small puffs of vapor. "I'm cold." Eleanor wrapped her daughter more tightly in the blankets, but she could feel the child's shivers increasing. Grace's lips had taken on a blue tinge, despite their efforts to keep her warm, and her breathing seemed shallow and labored. "She needs real shelter." Eleanor said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. Not just blankets and hope. Swift Arrow studied Grace with concern, his dark eyes noting details that spoke of hard experience with mountain sickness and exposure. The heart of stone is still many miles ahead. She may not last. A distant shout echoed off the canyon walls below them, followed by another closer and more urgent. "They've found our trail," Swift Arrow said grimly, already moving toward the horses. "We must go." But as Eleanor tried to lift Grace into the saddle, the little girl suddenly sagged against her chest like a rag doll. The child's forehead burned with fever, even as her body shook with violent chills that no amount of warming could stop. "Grace," Eleanor touched her daughter's face, feeling the telltale heat of serious illness burning beneath skin, pale as mountain snow. "Grace, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Grace's eyes fluttered open, but they seemed unfocused, glassy with fever and exhaustion. "I'm tired, Mama. Can we go home now? I want to sleep in my own bed." Eleanor's heart clenched like a fist around barbed wire. Home, if only such a place still existed for any of them. "We can't travel with her like this," she told Swift Arrow, though speaking the words aloud made them feel like a death sentence. "She needs medicine, rest, warmth. The nearest white settlement is Fort Collins, 3 days' ride east through country crawling with Blackwood's men." Swift Arrow's expression was grim as the mountain peaks surrounding them. "And she cannot survive 3 days in this condition." Eleanor felt the walls of the world closing in around her like the sides of a grave. They were trapped between Blackwood's hunters and the unforgiving wilderness with a desperately sick child and nowhere left to run. "Then we're finished." She said the words, tasting like ashes in her mouth. Swift Arrow was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the peaks around them as if searching for answers written in stone and snow. Then his expression hardened with the kind of resolve Eleanor had seen in Thomas's face when he'd made decisions that would cost him everything. "No, there is another way." He turned to Rose, who had been listening with the grave attention of someone far older than her 12 years. "Can you handle a horse alone for several hours?" "I think so," Rose replied, though Eleanor could hear the uncertainty beneath her brave words. "What are you planning?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew and didn't like the answer. "There is a trading post perhaps half a day's ride northwest through the high passes. Frenchman named Dubois runs it. He trades with both whites and Indians, asks no questions, and cares nothing for territorial politics. He will have medicine for the child. You're going alone. I can move faster without you, and I know trails that no white tracker can follow. You and the girls will be safe in the heart of stone. There are caves there, shelter from the wind and protection from pursuit." Eleanor felt panic rising in her throat like flood water. "And if you don't come back," Swift Arrow met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her breath catch, not just determination, but a promise that went deeper than words. "Then you wait for spring and try to reach one of the northern settlements." "But I will come back, Eleanor Hartwell. That is a vow spoken before the mountain spirits themselves." Another shout echoed from below, definitely closer now, followed by the sound of shod hooves on stone. "Go." Eleanor said the word torn from her chest like a piece of her soul. "We'll manage somehow." Swift Arrow mounted his horse, then paused, as if there was something more he needed to say. Finally, he reached into his shirt and withdrew something that caught the pale sunlight, a silver necklace bearing a small cross. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The cross was distinctive with intricate etching around the edges and a small dent near the base that she remembered watching Thomas make when he dropped it while shoeing a horse. "How do you have that?" she whispered. "Thomas was buried wearing—" "Your husband saved my life, Eleanor." Swift Arrow's voice was quiet, but it carried across the mountain air like thunder. 2 years ago, during what the Army called a police action against hostile Indians, I was wounded helpless when a trooper raised his rifle to finish me. Thomas Hartwell stepped between us and took the bullet, meant for my heart. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her like a ship in heavy seas. That's not possible. Thomas never mentioned any fighting with Indians. He said he fell from his horse. He told you he fell because he was protecting more than just one Cheyenne warrior that day. He was protecting the secret that might have gotten him court-martialed, or worse, that he had shown mercy to an enemy of the United States. Eleanor's mind raced back to that night 2 years ago, when Thomas had come home with his shoulder bandaged, claiming he'd been thrown from his horse and caught a tree branch. She'd believed him because she'd had no reason not to, because Thomas had never lied to her about anything important. As they carried him away to the field surgeon, he gave me this cross and told me his name. Told me about his wife and daughters in Copper Ridge, made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would watch over his family. You've been watching us all this time, from a distance, making sure no harm came to you or the girls, honoring the debt I owed to the man who valued a stranger's life above his own safety. Eleanor stared at the cross, seeing it with new eyes. He never said anything. Never mentioned saving someone's life. Would it have mattered to your people? Most whites wouldn't see saving an Indian as anything worth mentioning. More likely, they'd see it as treason. But Thomas wasn't like most people. No, he wasn't. Swift Arrow's voice was soft with memory and grief. He taught me something that night, as he lay bleeding in the dirt, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It is a lesson I have carried every day since. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks, hot against skin, numbed by cold and shock. Even in death, Thomas was still protecting them, still finding ways to keep his promise to love and honor his family. Grace was right, she whispered. What? She said you reminded her of her papa. Not in how you looked, but in how you made her feel safe. Swift Arrow smiled. And for the first time since meeting him, Eleanor saw genuine joy break through the grief that shadowed his features. Then I am deeply honored by the comparison. He wheeled his horse toward the narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains, then called back over his shoulder, "The Heart of Stone lies 3 miles north. Follow the trail marked with red stones. My people placed them there for travelers seeking sanctuary. And Eleanor, trust your instincts. They have served you well so far." Then he was gone, disappearing around a bend in the trail, like smoke dispersing in the wind, leaving Eleanor alone with her daughters, and the sound of their pursuers growing ever closer. The Heart of Stone revealed itself like a secret whispered by the mountains themselves. Eleanor followed the trail of red stones through increasingly treacherous terrain, Grace burning with fever in her arms, while Rose led their horse with the grim determination of someone far older than her years. The sacred place was a natural amphitheater, carved from living rock, hidden among the peaks, like a temple built by gods rather than men. Ancient pictographs covered the canyon walls, spirals and animals and human figures that seemed to dance and shift in the changing light, and they're carved into the rock face itself were the caves Swift Arrow had mentioned. Eleanor found one marked with symbols she couldn't read, but somehow understood protective signs that spoke of sanctuary and safety. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, a natural chamber with a fire ring made of carefully arranged stones and ventilation shafts that carried smoke away without revealing their presence to outside observers. She made Grace as comfortable as possible on a bed of pine boughs and their remaining blankets, while Rose gathered deadfall for a fire. The little girl's fever had worsened during the climb, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking to people who weren't there, Thomas mostly asking him when he was coming home, "Will Grace be all right?" Rose asked as they sat by the fire that night, her young voice trying to be strong while her eyes revealed the fear she was trying to hide. Eleanor wanted to lie to offer false comfort, but Rose was too old and had seen too much to be fooled by empty platitudes. "I don't know, sweetheart. But Swift Arrow will bring medicine, and your sister is stronger than she looks." "Stronger than me?" "Different strong. You're both strong in your own ways. Grace has the strength to keep fighting, even when she's scared and sick. And you have the strength to take care of others, even when you're frightened yourself. Rose was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames with eyes that held too much understanding for a 12-year-old. Do you think Papa would be proud of us for not giving up? Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. I think your Papa is very proud. And I think he'd want us to keep fighting no matter what comes next. That night, Grace's fever broke in a torrent of sweat that soaked through every blanket they possessed. Eleanor changed her daughter's clothes by firelight, terrified by how light and fragile the 8-year-old felt in her arms, like a bird with hollow bones barely clinging to life. Mama. Grace's voice was barely a whisper in the cave's echoing silence. I'm here, baby. The man with the feathers in his hair. He's nice, isn't he? Swift Arrow, yes, I think he is. He has sad eyes like Papa did sometimes. But he makes me feel safe like Papa used to. Eleanor kissed her daughter's forehead, relieved to find it cooler than before. Try to sleep now, sweetheart. As Grace drifted off into what looked like natural sleep, rather than fever-induced unconsciousness, Eleanor found herself thinking about Swift Arrow's revelation. The idea that Thomas had risked everything to save a Cheyenne warrior's life didn't surprise her. It was exactly the kind of thing her husband would have done. But the knowledge that Swift Arrow had been watching over them all this time, honoring a debt to a dead man, filled her with emotions she couldn't quite name. She was still thinking about him when the sound of approaching hooves echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's rifle and moved to the cave mouth, though she knew 3 bullets wouldn't be enough if Blackwood's men had found them. But the voice that called out from the darkness was wonderfully familiar. Eleanor, it's Swift Arrow. I'm coming up. Relief flooded through her with the force of a spring flood as the Cheyenne warrior appeared in the firelight, leading his horse and carrying what looked like medical supplies in bulging saddlebags. You came back, she said, surprising herself with how much emotion colored those 3 simple words. I said I would. Swift Arrow knelt beside Grace, checking her temperature with the back of his hand before opening his supplies. The fever is breaking. That's good, means her body is winning the fight. He produced a bottle of clear liquid and several packets of dried herbs from his saddlebags. Willow bark tea for any remaining fever laudanum for pain, and something Dubois called mountain medicine, herbs his Shoshone wife swears by for mountain sickness. What did you trade for all this? Swift Arrow was quiet for a moment, his fingers touching the empty place on his chest where the silver cross had hung. Something that belonged to my wife. Her grandmother's silver bracelet, the last thing I had of her family's heritage. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Swift Arrow, it was metal and memory. This is a child's life. He looked up at her with eyes that held no regret, only determination. There is no comparison. You said you had other news. Rose prompted, showing the kind of direct intelligence that reminded Eleanor painfully of Thomas. Swift Arrow's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. Dubois had visitors recently, men asking questions about a white woman and 2 children. Your Judge Blackwood has posted a reward throughout the territory. Eleanor's blood chilled. How much? $1,000, dead or alive. The amount hit Eleanor like a physical blow. $1,000 was more money than most families in the territory saw in 5 years, enough to make bounty hunters out of honest men and killers out of desperate ones. It gets worse. Swift Arrow continued. Blackwood has sent word to the cavalry at Fort Collins, claiming you've been taken captive by hostile Indians. He's requested a military expedition to rescue you and bring your captors to justice. Eleanor sank down beside the fire, feeling the weight of hopelessness settling over her like a lead blanket. How long before they arrive? Perhaps a week, maybe less if they push hard. And Eleanor, there's something else. Swift Arrow's voice carried a note she hadn't heard before, uncertainty mixed with what might have been fear. Dubois mentioned that one of Blackwood's men was asking specific questions about me. They know a Cheyenne warrior is helping you. Then you're in as much danger as we are. More, perhaps. A white woman might be taken alive for questioning. A hostile Indian found with captive white children. Swift Arrow shrugged eloquently. There would be no questions, no trial. Just a bullet and a shallow grave. Eleanor stared into the fire, watching flames dance and flicker like her hopes for the future. Then it's over. Even if we run to Canada, they'll track us down eventually. And now we've made you a target too. Not necessarily. Swift Arrow's voice carried a note she hadn't heard before the sound of a plan taking shape. There is something I haven't told you about myself, Eleanor Hartwell. Something that might change our entire situation. What? Swift Arrow reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded document worn from handling but still official looking. I am not just a warrior, as you suppose. Among my people I serve as what you might call a diplomat, one who speaks with white authorities when treaties must be negotiated or grievances addressed. Eleanor stared at the document, which appeared to be some kind of governmental correspondence. I don't understand. Your territorial governor appointed me as an official liaison between the Cheyenne Nation and the United States government 2 years ago after the incident where your husband saved my life. The military investigation that followed led to recognition that perhaps not all conflicts between our peoples stem from Indian aggression. The implications hit Eleanor like lightning. You're saying you have official status, legal authority, within certain limits, yes. And one of those limits includes the right to investigate claims of injustice against Indians or those under their protection. Swift Arrow's smile was sharp as a blade. It seems to me that a corrupt territorial judge threatening peaceful trade relations might fall under my jurisdiction. Eleanor felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in days. You're talking about going back to Copper Ridge. Not just going back, returning in official capacity with you and your daughters under my diplomatic protection. Blackwood can murder fugitives in secret, but he cannot execute a diplomatic envoy and his charges in front of witnesses without bringing down the wrath of the territorial government. Rose looked up from where she'd been listening to their conversation with the intense focus of someone whose life depended on understanding every word. You mean we're going to fight back? Though we're going to demand justice. Swift Arrow corrected. But yes, we're going to fight. The plan Swift Arrow outlined over the next 2 hours was audacious to the point of madness. But as Eleanor listened, she began to see the brilliant simplicity underlying its apparent complexity. Instead of running deeper into the wilderness like hunted animals, they would return to Copper Ridge as an official delegation. Swift Arrow would present himself as a representative of the Cheyenne Nation, investigating reports of corruption and injustice, while Eleanor and her daughters would be under his diplomatic protection as key witnesses in a federal investigation. It's insane, Eleanor protested when he finished explaining. Blackwood will have us shot on sight. But not if we arrive with sufficient ceremony and witnesses. Men like Blackwood survive by operating in shadows, force them into daylight, and they become vulnerable. Swift Arrow's eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. Besides, I've already sent word ahead through Dubois' network. By the time we arrive, half the territory will know that a federal diplomatic mission is investigating corruption in Copper Ridge. And you think people will believe we're really under federal protection? They'll believe it because it will be true. Swift Arrow tapped the official document he'd shown her. This gives me legitimate authority to investigate and report directly to the territorial governor. Blackwood may be corrupt, but he's not stupid. He won't risk open defiance of federal authority without being absolutely certain he can cover his tracks. The plan had other components that revealed Swift Arrow's sophisticated understanding of white politics and law. Messages would be sent to newspapers in Cheyenne and Denver about the diplomatic mission, ensuring that word reached people with influence beyond Blackwood's control. Their arrival would be timed to coincide with the weekly supply train that brought witnesses from neighboring settlements. The key, Swift Arrow explained, is to make it impossible for Blackwood to act without destroying his own position. Men like him maintain power through careful calculation. They only strike when they're certain of victory. Create enough uncertainty, enough witnesses, enough potential consequences, and he'll be forced to play by rules that favor us rather than him. And if it doesn't work, Eleanor asked, then we'll be no worse off than we are now. Probably dead, but at least we'll have died fighting rather than running. Eleanor considered the plan as Grace continued recovering, and Rose helped Swift Arrow prepare their new identities. The idea of voluntarily walking back into Blackwood's domain terrified her. But she had to admit it offered something that running never could, the possibility of actually winning. More than that, though, it offered justice. Not just survival, but the chance to make Blackwood pay for his crimes and ensure he could never hurt another family the way he'd hurt theirs. For 3 days, they prepared, waiting for Grace to regain enough strength for travel and for Swift Arrow's network of contacts to spread word of the coming diplomatic mission. Eleanor learned that the Cheyenne warrior had far more resources and connections than she'd initially suspected, friends among both Indians and whites, who owed him favors, access to information networks that spanned the territory, and a reputation for fairness that had earned him respect even among traditional enemies. "You're not just a warrior or a diplomat, are you?" she asked one evening as they sat by their fire in the heart of stone. "Among my people, leaders are expected to be many things: scout, hunter, negotiator, protector of the innocent, keeper of traditions." Swift Arrow poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. "Your husband understood this. He saw past the savage his people had taught him to hate, and recognized a man trying to protect his family and his people's future. Do you think we can really make this work? I think your husband died believing that people of goodwill could overcome hatred and ignorance if they had the courage to stand together." Swift Arrow's voice was quiet but firm. "I would like to prove him right." On the 4th day, they began their descent toward Copper Ridge and whatever fate awaited them there. Eleanor barely recognized herself in the transformation Swift Arrow had orchestrated. Her auburn hair was braided with colored ribbons in a style that suggested extended contact with Indian culture, while carefully applied plant dyes had darkened her skin just enough to support their story. Rose and Grace received similar treatment, though less extensively. "Remember," Swift Arrow reminded them as they rode through country that grew increasingly familiar, "you sought shelter with my band after being falsely accused. I, impressed by your courage and convinced of your innocence, have agreed to escort you back to face your accusers under the protection of diplomatic immunity." "And if someone recognizes us," Rose asked, "then we tell the truth that you were driven into exile by a corrupt judge who couldn't tolerate being refused by a woman of principle." Swift Arrow's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Blackwood has told everyone you were killed or captured by hostile Indians. Seeing you return alive and under my protection will contradict his narrative and raise questions he won't want to answer." As they crested the final ridge before Copper Ridge, Eleanor felt her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The familiar buildings spread out below them looked smaller than she remembered: Murphy's saloon, Peterson's workshop, her own bakery with its boarded windows, standing like a gravestone marking the death of her old life. "Remember," Swift Arrow said quietly, "from this moment forward, we are not hiding. We are announcing ourselves. Confidence, Eleanor. Your daughters are watching and they need to see that we believe in what we're doing." They rode down the main street at a measured pace. Swift Arrow, in full ceremonial dress, with eagle feathers in his hair, and traditional weapons clearly visible, but peacefully displayed. Eleanor and her daughters flanked him on either side, no longer refugees, but honored guests under federal protection. The effect was immediate and dramatic. People emerged from buildings, pointing and whispering as word spread like wildfire through the small community. Children ran alongside their horses, while adults gathered in clusters on the wooden sidewalks. By the time they reached the center of town, A crowd had gathered in the dusty main square. "Now where is Judge Blackwood?" "Satter Hardy starts." Swift Arrow called out in a voice that carried across the square with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I have come to speak with him about matters of mutual concern to our peoples." "Right here." Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his face cycling through emotions as he took in the impossible sight before him. Shock at seeing Eleanor and her daughters alive, fury at being outmaneuvered, and calculation as he realized the delicate position he was in. Eleanor watched her former tormentor struggle to process what he was seeing. Blackwood was dressed in his finest clothes, as if he'd been expecting some kind of formal occasion, but his composure was cracking like ice under spring sun. "I am Swift Arrow of the Cheyenne Nation," the warrior announced with formal dignity. "Come under flag of truce to discuss trade agreements and the return of these white women who sought shelter with my people after fleeing injustice in this community." "These women are criminals," Blackwood said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Fugitives from justice who—" "Interesting." Swift Arrow's tone remained calm and conversational, but Eleanor could hear steel underneath the silk. "They told me they were innocent victims of false accusations driven out by a corrupt official who coveted their property and couldn't accept rejection from an honorable woman. Perhaps we should examine the evidence together." "You have no authority here, Indian." Blackwood's voice carried a sneer, but Eleanor noticed he'd stepped back slightly, as if Swift Arrow's presence made him physically uncomfortable. "Actually, I do." Swift Arrow produced a folded document from his coat with theatrical precision. "Letter from Territorial Governor Campbell recognizing my diplomatic status and granting full authority to investigate claims of injustice that might affect peaceful relations between our peoples. Would you like to read it yourself, or shall I have someone in this crowd do so aloud?" Eleanor bit back a smile as she watched Blackwood's face pale. The letter might have been legitimate or carefully forged, but it looked official enough to give anyone pause, especially someone who'd built their power on bureaucratic manipulation. "This is ridiculous." Blackwood blustered, but his usual commanding presence had diminished noticeably. "These women are proven criminals." "Proven how?" Swift Arrow interrupted smoothly. "By a trial where no defense was allowed, by evidence that could have been planted by anyone with access to flour sacks and poison, by a judge who had already publicly declared his intention to marry the accused regardless of her wishes." A murmur went through the crowd, like wind through wheat. Eleanor realized that Swift Arrow wasn't just defending her, he was putting Blackwood himself on trial in the court of public opinion, using the man's own arrogance against him. "I have here." Swift Arrow continued producing another document, a preliminary report compiled for the territorial governor detailing numerous irregularities in local judicial proceedings. Cases where evidence appeared manufactured, where defendants were denied basic rights, where property changed hands under suspicious circumstances. Blackwood's face had gone from pale to ashen. "What do you want?" "Justice. A fair trial for these women conducted according to territorial law with proper legal representation and impartial witnesses. Failing that, I will escort them to the territorial capital where their case can be heard by higher authorities." "And if I refuse?" Swift Arrow's smile was polite, but carried unmistakable menace. "Then I will report to my people and to the federal government that the whites of Copper Ridge prefer corruption to justice, fear to honor." Such a report might significantly complicate future treaty negotiations and trade agreements. The threat was subtle, but clear refuse to grant a fair trial and risk escalating tensions that could bring unwanted federal attention to the entire territory. Eleanor watched Blackwood wrestle with his options, all of them bad, from his perspective. Grant a fair trial and risk exposure of his entire network of corruption or refuse, and face consequences from territorial and federal authorities who were already suspicious of his methods. "Very well," Blackwood said finally, the words seeming to stick in his throat like broken glass. "But this trial will be conducted according to proper territorial law with established procedures." Of course. I would expect nothing less from a distinguished jurist. Swift Arrow's smile widened, and Eleanor saw something predatory in the expression. "And naturally, as a diplomatic observer representing federal interests, I will be present throughout to ensure fairness and proper procedure." "Fine. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and terror that left her lightheaded. They had survived the first test, but the real challenge lay ahead. Tomorrow would determine whether Swift Arrow's gamble paid off, or whether they'd simply engineered a more public execution. That night, they camped outside town under Swift Arrow's diplomatic protection, though Eleanor's suspected armed guards were watching them from the shadows. She lay awake staring at stars that seemed colder and more distant than they had in the mountains, wondering if she would see another sunset. "Mama." Grace's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we going to be all right?" Eleanor thought about lying, about offering false comfort in what might be their last night together. Instead, she chose honesty. "I don't know, Grace. But whatever happens, we're going to face it together. As a family. All of us, even Swift Arrow." Eleanor glanced toward the fire where the Cheyenne warrior sat keeping watch, his silhouette black against the flames, as he maintained the vigil that had protected them so many nights. "Yes," she said, realizing as she spoke that it was true in ways that went deeper than mere alliance. "All of us." The trial began precisely at 9 o'clock in Murphy's saloon, which had been hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom for the occasion. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different from Eleanor's previous experience with Copper Ridge Justice. Word of the proceedings had spread throughout the territory during the night, and the room was packed with observers, some friendly to Eleanor, others loyal to Blackwood, most simply curious about the unprecedented diplomatic situation. Swift Arrow sat in the front row, resplendent in his ceremonial dress, taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. His presence seemed to affect everyone in the room, like a storm front, a constant reminder that this trial was being watched by forces far beyond local politics. Blackwood presided from behind the bar, but his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous formality. The easy arrogance that had characterized Eleanor's first trial was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the careful precision of a man walking through a minefield. "Court is now in session." Blackwood announced, his voice carrying less authority than usual. "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell stands accused of malicious destruction of property and attempted murder by poisoning. The evidence, Your Honor." A new voice interrupted from the back of the room, cultured and carrying the unmistakable authority of education and position. Eleanor turned to see a distinguished man in an expensive city suit, making his way forward carrying a leather briefcase that suggested serious legal business. "And you are?" Blackwood asked, though Eleanor could see he already suspected the answer and didn't like it. "Jonathan Carver, attorney at law, representing Mrs. Hartwell and her interests." The man's smile was pleasant, but sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "I've traveled from Cheyenne at the request of certain territorial officials to ensure these proceedings meet proper federal standards for due process." Eleanor's heart leaped. She had no idea who had arranged for legal representation. Swift Arrow's mysterious network she suspected, but the lawyer's presence changed everything. This was no longer Blackwood's private court where he could manipulate evidence and intimidate witnesses. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Not at all, Your Honor. Every citizen of the territory has the right to legal representation as guaranteed by Territorial Statute 247B and federal constitutional protections." Carver's smile never wavered. "I'm sure a distinguished jurist such as yourself is familiar with the relevant precedents." Blackwood had no choice but to proceed, though Eleanor could see frustration and growing alarm in his eyes as he realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. The prosecution's case, presented by Blackwood himself, since Copper Ridge had no official prosecutor, relied heavily on the flour sack allegedly found near his poisoned cattle. But under Carver's skilled cross-examination, the evidence began to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. Judge Blackwood. Carver began with deceptive mildness. You stated under oath that this flour sack was discovered the morning after your cattle died, correct? That's correct. And this sack bears what you claim is Mrs. Hartwell's bakery mark. Obviously it does. Anyone can see. Please examine the exhibit more carefully, Your Honor. Mrs. Hartwell, would you please approach and tell the court what you observe about this supposed evidence? Eleanor stood and studied the burlap sack that had been the foundation of Blackwood's case against her. Up close, she could see what the lawyer was driving at. The mark is wrong, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed saloon. My bakery mark is stamped in blue ink with a specific typeface. This one is black ink, and the lettering style is completely different. Furthermore, Carver continued producing a document from his briefcase. I have here a purchase record from Murphy's General Store indicating that this particular style of sack was discontinued 8 months ago. Mrs. Hartwell's bakery switched to a different supplier last spring after her husband's death. How do you explain this discrepancy, Judge Blackwood? Blackwood's face flushed red above his collar. Someone could have saved an old sack, used it to... Someone, yes. The question is who and why. Carver turned to address the jury. 12 men from the surrounding area deliberately chosen from outside Copper Ridge to avoid Blackwood's direct influence. Gentlemen, I submit that this evidence has been deliberately fabricated to support a predetermined verdict. The trial continued through the morning and into the afternoon, with Carver systematically dismantling every piece of evidence against Eleanor. He produced witnesses who testified to her good character and moral standing documentation showing Blackwood's repeated attempts to pressure her into marriage and financial records, indicating irregularities in land ownership that benefited only the judge himself. But it was Swift Arrow's testimony that proved most damaging to Blackwood's case and reputation. Mr. Swift Arrow, Blackwood said when called upon to cross-examine the witness, clearly uncomfortable with addressing an Indian as an equal in his own courtroom. You claim these women sought shelter with your people after fleeing what you call injustice. What gives you the authority to make such determinations? 2 years of observing Judge Blackwood's methods. Swift Arrow replied calmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. You see, this is not the first time I have encountered the judge's particular brand of frontier justice. A shocked murmur ran through the courtroom like electricity. What exactly are you implying? Blackwood demanded, though Eleanor could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. I am stating a fact. 2 years ago, Judge Blackwood ordered a cavalry raid on a peaceful Cheyenne hunting party that included my wife and young son. He claimed we were stealing cattle from his ranch, though no evidence of such theft was ever produced. You're lying. Blackwood snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. Swift Arrow produced yet another document from his seemingly inexhaustible supply. I have here a copy of the official military investigation that followed the raid. The report concludes, and I quote, "No evidence of cattle theft or hostile activity was found. The raid appears to have been based on false information provided by local civilian authorities." Swift Arrow looked directly at Blackwood, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Not hatred, but the patient fury of a man who had waited 2 years for justice. The raid resulted in the deaths of 7 Cheyenne, including my wife and 6-year-old son. No one was held accountable. No compensation was offered. No apology was given. Swift Arrow's voice remained level, but everyone in the room could feel the weight of his grief and anger. When these women told me they had been falsely accused by Judge Blackwood, I recognized the pattern: manufactured evidence, predetermined guilt, violence against the innocent. The courtroom was silent as a tomb. Eleanor watched Blackwood's face cycle through expressions of rage, fear, and desperation as he realized the trap that had been laid for him. This trial wasn't just about her innocence. It was about his entire career of corruption and abuse brought into the light for everyone to see. Furthermore, Attorney Carver added, rising from his seat with the timing of a master showman, "I have here additional documentation suggesting that Judge Blackwood has engaged in a pattern of such behavior over the past 5 years. Falsified evidence, manipulated trials, property seizures based on questionable legal grounds. Now this is a witch hunt." Blackwood exploded, abandoning any pretense of judicial dignity. "A conspiracy by Indians and outside agitators to undermine legitimate authority. The only conspiracy here," Swift Arrow said quietly, "is the one you have waged against justice itself." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman, a weathered rancher from 30 miles east who owed Blackwood nothing, stood to deliver their verdict. "We find the defendant Eleanor Hartwell not guilty on all charges," he announced in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the packed saloon. "Furthermore, we recommend that territorial authorities conduct a full investigation into the conduct of Judge Matthias Blackwood in this and other matters that have come to light during these proceedings." Eleanor felt her knees nearly buckle with relief as Rose and Grace rushed to embrace her, tears streaming down all their faces. After weeks of running and hiding and fearing for their lives, they had finally found justice. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "This court does not recognize this verdict," he declared, rising from behind the bar, with a face twisted by rage and desperation. "These proceedings have been contaminated by outside interference and Indian manipulation. As the duly appointed territorial judge, I hereby Judge Blackwood." Attorney Carver interrupted with calm authority, "You are no longer presiding over this or any other court. As of this morning, I carry warrants for your arrest on multiple charges of judicial corruption filed by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in conjunction with federal authorities." Carver produced an official-looking document with ribbons and seals that looked impressively authentic. Eleanor suspected it might be as real as Swift Arrow's diplomatic credentials, which was to say, real enough to serve their purposes. Blackwood's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but Swift Arrow was already rising from his seat, moving with the fluid grace that had served him so well in the mountains. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," the Cheyenne warrior said quietly. "There are too many witnesses, and violence against a federal officer carries severe penalties." For a moment, Eleanor thought Blackwood might surrender. Then his face twisted with the kind of desperate fury that made cornered animals most dangerous. And she realized that a man who had built his empire on fear and corruption would never submit to justice quietly. "You want to see corruption?" Blackwood snarled, drawing his pistol in a motion made clumsy by rage and desperation. "I'll show you corruption. This whole territory belongs to me, and I'll burn it all down before I let some high-minded fools and their Indian friends take it away." He swung the gun toward Eleanor and her daughters with the clear intention of eliminating the witnesses who could destroy him. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor saw the barrel of Blackwood's pistol turning toward her children. She saw Rose step protectively in front of Grace. With the same selfless courage her father had shown, saw Swift Arrow launching himself forward with desperate speed. But it was Rose herself who acted decisively. During the long trial, the 12-year-old had been quietly working at something behind her chair, loosening the rope that held back one of the heavy curtains covering the saloon's front windows. As Blackwood raised his gun, she yanked hard on the rope with all her strength. The massive curtain rod, weighted with iron fittings, came crashing down onto Blackwood's gun arm with a sound like breaking bones. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, sending splinters of wood raining down on the panicked crowd. Swift Arrow reached Blackwood a heartbeat later, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs and fury that sent tables flying and chairs splintering across the saloon floor. They fought with the desperate intensity of men who knew only one of them would walk away alive. Blackwood used his greater size and weight trying to crush Swift Arrow with brute force, while the Cheyenne warrior relied on speed and skill honed by years of survival in an unforgiving world. Eleanor grabbed her daughters and pulled them toward the door, but she couldn't help watching the brutal struggle that would determine their ultimate fate. These two men represented everything that had shaped her life over the past weeks. The corruption that had destroyed her security, and the honor that had saved her family. Blackwood managed to get his hands around Swift Arrow's throat, his greater weight beginning to tell as the warrior's face darkened from lack of air. For a terrifying moment, Eleanor thought they were about to lose everything they'd fought so hard to win. "Your husband taught me something." Swift Arrow gasped, his voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent saloon. "He taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's protecting those who can't protect themselves." With a surge of desperate strength, fueled by honor and determination, Swift Arrow broke Blackwood's grip and drove his knee into the larger man's stomach. As Blackwood doubled over, gasping for air, Swift Arrow's elbow caught him squarely in the temple. Judge Matthias Blackwood collapsed to the saloon floor and didn't get up again. The room fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whistle of wind through the mountains. Swift Arrow stood over his fallen opponent, blood trickling from cuts on his forehead and knuckles, but otherwise unharmed. "Is he dead?" someone asked from the crowd. Attorney Carver knelt beside Blackwood and checked for a pulse. "Unconscious, but alive. He'll survive to stand trial for his crimes." Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months, complete overwhelming relief that seemed to flow through her veins like warm honey. It was over. The nightmare that had begun with a rejected marriage proposal and escalated to exile and pursuit had finally ended. But there was still one more revelation waiting. As the crowd dispersed and Blackwood was carried away under guard by men who had once served him but now recognized higher authority, Swift Arrow approached Eleanor and her daughters. His ceremonial paint was smeared with sweat and blood, but his dark eyes held a warmth that made Eleanor's heart skip beats. "It's finished," he said simply. "Thanks to you. To all of us." Eleanor looked around at the faces watching them, townspeople who had once turned their backs, now looking at her with respect, and something that might have been shame for their earlier cowardice. "Your daughters were very brave today," Swift Arrow said, kneeling to Grace's level. Both of them showed the kind of courage their father would have been proud of. Rose blushed at the praise while Grace threw her arms around Swift Arrow's waist with the unconscious affection of a child who had found safety in the most unexpected place. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, though for the first time in weeks, the question didn't carry the weight of desperation. "Now you rebuild your life. The bakery is yours again. Carver has the legal documents to prove it. The territory will compensate you for your losses, and Blackwood's other victims will finally have justice." Swift Arrow paused, then Eleanor saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "As for me, yes, I have fulfilled my promise to your husband. His family is safe, his enemies defeated, the debt of honor paid in full." Swift Arrow's voice was quiet, but Eleanor could hear uncertainty underneath the words. "My obligations are complete. So you'll leave?" The question came out sharper than Eleanor had intended, revealing emotions she hadn't fully acknowledged, even to herself. "That depends." "On what?" Swift Arrow smiled with an expression that contained hope and vulnerability in equal measure. "On whether a Cheyenne warrior would be welcome in the home of a white widow and her daughters. On whether it's possible to build something new from the ashes of what was lost." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this man who had risked everything to honor a debt to her dead husband, who had shown her daughters kindness when the world had shown them only cruelty, who had fought for justice when everyone else had chosen the safety of cowardice. She thought about Thomas, about the kind of man he had been and the values he had lived by. Would he approve of what she was feeling? Would he understand that love and family could take forms that transcended the narrow boundaries society tried to impose? Looking at Rose and Grace, her eldest daughter grinning with obvious approval, her youngest still clinging to Swift Arrow like an anchor in a storm, Eleanor knew the answer. "I think," she said slowly, testing each word as she spoke it, "that such a warrior would be very welcome indeed. I think Thomas would want us to choose love over fear, hope over hatred. And the people of this town, they may not understand or approve." Eleanor looked around at the faces watching them, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to outright approval. Times were changing, she realized. The old hatreds that had seemed so fixed and permanent were beginning to crack under the weight of individual courage and shared humanity. "Then we'll teach them," she said firmly. "We'll show them that different doesn't mean dangerous, that understanding can replace fear if people have the courage to try." 6 months later, Eleanor's bakery had become the most successful business in Copper Ridge, not just because of her excellent bread and pastries, but because of the unique partnership she had formed with Swift Arrow. He had brought trade relationships with various Indian tribes passing through the territory, while she provided a meeting place where whites and Indians could interact peacefully for the first time in the territory's history. Rose had become Swift Arrow's eager student in tracking wilderness survival and Cheyenne language, while Grace delighted in learning traditional songs and stories that connected her to a culture she'd never imagined she could understand. The three of them often visited Thomas's grave together, where Eleanor would tell her late husband about their new life and the unexpected family that had grown from the seeds of tragedy. The changes in Copper Ridge extended far beyond Eleanor's bakery. With Blackwood's corruption exposed and his network of fear dismantled, honest men began to speak up about problems that had festered in silence for years. A new judge arrived from the territorial capital, a fair-minded man who believed in actual justice rather than personal profit. Trade relationships with local Indian tribes, previously impossible due to Blackwood's deliberate antagonism, began to flourish. Attorney Carver had stayed in town long enough to ensure that all of Blackwood's victims received justice and compensation. The disgraced judge himself had been sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison, his properties seized, to pay restitution to those he had wronged. Eleanor received not only clear title to her bakery and land, but additional compensation that allowed her to expand her business and secure her daughter's futures. On a crisp autumn evening, exactly 1 year after their exile had begun, Eleanor stood in her bakery's kitchen preparing bread for the next day, while Swift Arrow taught Rose to carve a traditional Cheyenne hunting knife, and Grace practiced writing Cheyenne symbols with charcoal on bark paper. The scene felt so natural, so right, that Eleanor sometimes forgot how impossible it would have seemed just months earlier. "Mama," Grace said, looking up from her writing, "can we visit Papa's grave tomorrow? I want to show him the story Swift Arrow taught me about the mountain spirits." "Of course, sweetheart." The next morning, all four of them walked the short distance to the cemetery that overlooked Copper Ridge from a hill dotted with pine trees. Eleanor carried wildflowers picked from the meadow where she and Thomas had once talked about their dreams for the future, while the girls brought small tokens, a smooth stone from Grace, a perfectly straight arrow Rose had carved herself. As they approached Thomas's grave, Eleanor noticed something that made her steps falter. A second headstone stood nearby, simple but carefully maintained, bearing an inscription in both English and Cheyenne symbols. "Swift Arrow?" she asked quietly. He nodded, understanding her unspoken question. "My wife and son. I moved their remains here last month so they could rest near the man who saved my life. I thought they would want to be close to the family that became mine." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the full meaning of the gesture. Swift Arrow hadn't just joined their family, he had brought his own lost loved ones into their circle of remembrance and healing. Without a word, she divided her wildflowers, placing half on Thomas's grave and half on the marker that honored Swift Arrow's wife and child. Rose and Grace followed her example, understanding instinctively that love and memory could encompass more than they had ever imagined. "They're all together now," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "All the people we lost watching over all the people we love now." As they walked back toward town, Rose running ahead while Grace held both Eleanor's and Swift Arrow's hands, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The terror and loss that had once seemed like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of something beautiful and unprecedented. A family built not on blood alone, but on choice, courage, and the radical decision to trust in love rather than fear. Behind them, the 4 graves rested peacefully in the Wyoming sunshine. Thomas Hartwell, who had died protecting a stranger. Swift Arrow's wife and child, whose deaths had led their survivor to protect a white family in return. And now, in the growing town of Copper Ridge, new stories of understanding and cooperation were being written every day. Eleanor had learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in standing alone against the darkness, but in opening your heart wide enough to let in the light even when it came from the most unexpected places. The last stand at Copper Ridge had ended not with more violence and division, but with the revolutionary act of choosing love over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair. And in that choice, they had all found their way home.